Senator from Kentucky.
Congress is poised to do what no American family would ever do. Congress is poised to spend a third more dollars than they receive. This is essentially equivalent to a family at home making $45,000 but spending $60,000. No American family can do that. But that's what's happening here. The spending that has been brought forward for our spending plans this year will lead to a $1.5 trillion deficit. So we bring in about $4.5 trillion and we're going to spend $6 trillion. It's reckless, it leads to inflation, it's a direct vote to steal your paycheck. Because what happens as we borrow more money, the Federal Reserve just prints up more money and they'll pay for all the debt that's created today, but that devalues your dollar. So when you go to the grocery store and your prices have risen 20%, you can thank the people today that are all for you and they're going to give you everything you want. Every program under the sun that grandmother and mother and apple pie wants, they're going to give you. But they're going to borrow the money. This is a bait and switch. It's like, what do you want, America? Here, we'll give it to you. It's free. You don't have to do anything. But it's borrowed. When they give you stuff that they buy with borrowed money, they create inflation. This has been going on for a while. But it has accelerated. It is at an alarming pace now. With the COVID lockdowns, we were borrowing $3 trillion. Then with the Biden years, we were borrowing over $1 trillion. We're still borrowing at $1.5 trillion. Why? Because their spending proposals take most of the spending off limits. 2/3 of our spending is entitlements. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps. That's 2/3 of the spending. That equals all of the money you pay in taxes. They've taken that off the limit. They've stuck their head in the sand and they said, we will not ever touch entitlements. Well, if you don't, you're not a serious person. If you don't, you're part of the problem. Entitlements is 2/3 of the spending. Do I want to do something to them? Do I take joy in knowing that we have to reform these? No. But if you don't reform them, they are an anchor around the neck of America, and they're destroying us by spending money we don't have. So 2/3 of the spending they're not even going to address. Now, the remaining third of spending, that's what we vote on, military spending and non-military spending. They call this discretionary spending. Of that remaining third, they took half of that off the table. So entitlements is 2/3 of the spending. That's going up at about 5 to 6%. The remaining third that we vote on is military and non-military. They said, well, we have to continue to expand the military. It's going to go up at 3%. So what are we left with? We're left with 1/2 of 1/3, 1/6 of government, about 16.6%, and we're going to say, oh, we're going to really try to rein in spending there. And there, what they do is they almost slow it down to 1 or 2%. This bill spends 1/3 more than comes in, and what it is going to lead to, and has been leading to, is the erosion of your paycheck, the explosion of your gas prices, and the explosion of your grocery bills. Nothing is changing. And you ask yourself, where are Republicans? We have a Republican majority in the House, and ostensibly Republicans are for reducing the debt. We have a filibuster-proof minority in the Senate, and ostensibly Senate Republicans are for taking control of the debt. And yet what happens? Nothing happens. The spending goes on apace. The deficit grows by day. So when did we get this spending bill? They have months and months to do this. When did we get it? At 2:32 a.m. on Thursday. And now it's rush, rush, rush. We've got to shovel that money out the door, most of which we don't have, or 1/3 of which we don't have. We got to borrow it quickly, shovel it out the door, because the government's going to shut down at Friday at midnight. Why is the government shutting down, and why are we up against a deadline? Because they didn't give us the 1,000-page bill till 2:30 in the morning on Thursday. You think we ought to read it? You think we ought to know what's in it? Republican and Democrat leadership gave this to us at 2:32 in the morning. 1,012-page bill, spends over $1 trillion. No one will be able to thoroughly read and know what's in this until after it's passed. But it's rush, 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 borrow more money, spend the money, and then try to deceive you into thinking that we gave you We brought you manna from heaven. We gave you all these gifts, these baubles. You're going to get a lot of free stuff. Every cause you like under the sun, you're going to get something for it in there, but they won't tell you the truth, that it's borrowed, it leads to inflation, and it's the biggest threat to our country. We are not threatened by other countries invading our country. We are a strong and mighty country to which I do not believe we have an external threat. But we have a threat internally, and most of it resides in this body, most of it resides in this body and in the House, with profligate spenders who are not adequately concerned with spending what comes in. They're just jolly well borrowing it. They're jolly well borrowing it and sending it abroad. Look, my sympathies are with Ukraine, but my first obligation of my oath of office is to my country. We can't just borrow money to send it to Ukraine. Once the war is finally over, which one day it will be over, the whole country is destroyed with bombs on both sides, and someone's going to be asked to pay for it. That's going to be you. Uncle Sam, Uncle Sucker will be asked to pay for it. This bill that we're looking at has 138 pages and over 1,400 earmarks, totaling $2 billion. What's an earmark? It's pork. It's not acknowledged by the Constitution. The Constitution says we can tax and spend money for the general welfare. We are allowed to spend money up here, according to the Constitution, only if it's for everyone. So a bike path in Rhode Island is for people who live in one city in Rhode Island. They should tax the people of Rhode Island. But you don't tax everybody for a bike path in Rhode Island. That is against the principle and the spirit of the Constitution. Now, these 1,400 earmarks are on top of the 6,000 earmarks we had last week for $12 billion. So total, between the two bills in the last 3 weeks, we have over 7,000 earmarks for $14 billion. That's a lot of pork. Democrat and Republican leadership want this reckless spending bill to pass quickly to make sure that no one has time to read or scrutinize the bill. Likely no one will ever have the time to review all of the $2 billion worth of earmarks before this is passed. Now, earmarks and pork barrel spending is not something brand new. It's been going on a long time. There was a conservative Democrat by the name of William Proxmire. This was a long time ago, in the old days when there used to be conservative Democrats who cared about the debt. And one of the programs that he talked about was, and he gave out a Golden Fleece Award to point out waste, but he said was one of his favorites. He said the government, in their infinite wisdom, decided to discover whether or not if you gave gin to a sunfish versus tequila, which would make the sunfish more aggressive. Think about it. These are pressing problems. $100,000 to give tequila to sunfish and gin and see which one made them more aggressive. Now, you would think that's so crazy. Certainly it was one-off, and that we discovered this kind of waste and we made it better. He talked about this for 15 years. And throughout the 15 years that he talked about, the research money going to crazy research like this, that not a penny should be spent on, increased. In fact, fast forward to last year, we're now like 30 some odd years after William Proxmire was talking about this. Last year, the main organization that's probably the most wasteful scientific accumulation of grants up here is the National Science Foundation. What did this body do? Republicans and Democrats? They voted to double the budget for the National Science Foundation. What else do they do at the National Science Foundation? Let's see. Nearly $1 million spent studying whether or not Japanese quail, if you give them cocaine, whether or not they're more sexually promiscuous. Your tax dollars. So anytime they're up here bragging about what they're doing and it's worth borrowing the money, you remind them what they're spending it on. Nearly $1 million to study Japanese quail to see if they're more sexually promiscuous when they take cocaine. Another one, this one was ostensibly for autism. But when they got to the autism, then they subgranted it and sent it here and there, and you never know where it's lined up. $750,000, and it went to some, let's just call them eggheads, that's the nicest word I can think of, to study what did Armstrong say, what did Neil Armstrong say when he landed on the moon? Was it one small step for man, or was it one small step for a man? $750,000 was spent studying what he actually said. They listened to the crackly old audio from the black and white tapes from the moon landing. And in the end, $750,000 later, they couldn't decide. Was it one step for man, one step for a man? This is the craziness that goes on. And yet it goes on and on and on. But here's what I would tell you is even when it's something justified. So let's say I have family members who have Alzheimer's. My mother-in-law died not too long ago with it. So I have a great deal of sympathy for the disease. And I think we're a big, rich country and a government. We could spend some money on Alzheimer's disease. But at the same time, we can't bankrupt our country. So if let's say we spend $100 million last year on Alzheimer's disease, am I a cruel person for saying we don't have enough money, we should spend $95 million this year? That never happens. Nothing ever gets smaller around here. Everything gets bigger. Everybody that wants something gets it. Put it on Uncle Sam's tab, and we have a $34 going on $35 trillion debt. The biggest payment now in our budget within about a year is going to be the interest on that. Here's a couple of the new earmarks that are in this bill. $2 million for the construction of a kelp and shellfish nursery in Maine. Now you might say, well, kelp, might taste really good, and I like to eat kelp. Good. There's already a $15 billion private market for kelp. There are companies, including in Maine, that are growing kelp for farm. I say wonderful. I'm not so sure if giving it to the government or to government universities is going to help these businesses or compete with them, but I don't think it's the job of the federal government to be involved in these parochial concerns. Another earmark that we discovered in this bill is $1.5 million to encourage video gaming in New York. Now, I've got nothing against people who play video games, sure. But $1.5 million to encourage people, I've seen kids. I don't think they need any encouragement. In fact, we might be better off spending $1.5 million to discourage kids from playing video games. But I see no reason when we're down and in the hole this year, $1.5 trillion, that we would do this. And this is an add-on. So these add-ons are earmarked. They're in the name of probably the senators from New York. They have decided that they want this video gaming thing in there. And maybe they know somebody in that industry. I don't know. Maybe a friend of theirs. That's why you don't earmark things. That's why things are supposed to be for the general welfare. You don't just say, oh, here's something I'm going to give to a specific parochial interest in my neighborhood or in my state. The third item we have is $388,000 for Columbia University. And I'm sure if the people who put this earmark in would be saying, well, I just love education and I'm just for education. Well, so am I. I'm a product of public school education, private school education, lots of education. I'm all for it. But you know what? Columbia University has a $13.6 billion endowment. They make $388,000 in 20 days of interest. You think maybe they could spend their own money? If you want to take a summer program to get into Columbia, which I think this money may be related to, it costs $12,500 for a 3-week course at Columbia. We are talking about extraordinarily wealthy people paying this and going to this school, but there's no reason for the taxpayers to be giving a rich university that has $13 billion any money. The next earmark we found was $249,000 for the Baltimore Symphony. People say, well, gosh, I love the symphony and I love music. So do I. But the thing is the way government's supposed to work is if you think that there's a general need for symphony money, you would pass a general symphony bill and we'd give money to all the symphonies and we'd make them part of government. One, we don't have the money to do that. Instead, we do something even worse. We shouldn't be in the symphony business in the federal government. We don't have any money. It's not part of the general welfare. But what happens here is the people on the Appropriations Committee that have seniority, that means you've been here, 50 to 100, between 50 and 100 years most of the time. That's an exaggeration. Let's just say 50 years. So they've been here 50 years, they rise to the top, and by golly, they get money for their symphony in their city. But that's not the way government's supposed to work. And there might even be less complaints if we had a surplus, but this is in the midst of borrowing it. So the $250 grand that we're going to send to the Baltimore Symphony is going to be borrowed from China. Everybody is all up in arms about China. Well, we're borrowing the money from China. We're becoming weaker than China because we keep spending money we don't have. The next earmark was $1 million for Cambridge, Massachusetts Community Center to install some solar panels. Now look, I like solar panels as well as anybody. I think it's really kind of cool to get some of your energy from solar panels. But this is a rich community. This is where Harvard is. This is where, some of the largest, most successful corporations in research are in Boston. You think they can't pay for solar panels? Solar panels aren't the general welfare. Our founding fathers said that all spending and taxation had to be for the general welfare, and they went one step further. In Article 1, Section 8, they laid out all the powers of Congress, all the things that we're allowed to do. And not listed in those was to buy solar panels for one town. You'd think that all the wealth of MIT and Harvard, all that wealth that's attracted to Cambridge, they'd be able to buy their own solar panels. But it has no place in a budget that's $1.5 trillion in the hole and only makes us weaker. The next earmark is $1 million for Martha's Vineyard Hospital, one of the richest zip codes in the United States. I've been to Martha's Vineyard. It's beautiful, but I can only afford to go one time. But the thing is, if you live there, that's wonderful. I'm all for wealthy people. I love that they have all these beautiful homes. I think President Obama may have a place there. But the thing is, pay for your own hospital. I've got little tiny hospitals with 40 beds in a really rural community that, because of all the rules and regulations, are barely breaking even in Kentucky, and I don't see sending millions of dollars to Martha's Vineyard. But once again, why did it go to Martha's Vineyard? Because somebody's been here for 50 years, they're on the Appropriations Committee, they put an earmark and say, I want the pork to go to Martha's Vineyard. Nobody makes a debate over whether Martha's Vineyard needs a bet more, than Harlan, Kentucky. They just stick an earmark in there and they get it because they've been here a long time. It's a terrible way to legislate, but it's a terrible way to legislate in the context of this enormous debt that we are amassing. This bill is teeming with about $2 billion worth of earmarks at a time when we can't afford the additional debt. Just days into the new year, the Treasury Department announced that the U.S. debt had surpassed $34 trillion. Hard to fathom. Chairman of the Federal Reserve came out and said it's an urgent problem. Jamie Dimon with J.P. Morgan Chase came out and said it was an urgent problem. And in the heels of people saying that it's an urgent problem, what happens? Congress rises to the occasion and borrows more money. Talk about tone deaf, completely tone deaf. We're just going to borrow another $1.5 trillion on the heels of $34 trillion. We are spending at such a rate that right now we are averaging $1 trillion to the debt every 90 days. If that pace continues, instead of $1.5 trillion, it could be up to $4 trillion in the next year. Since this year, the U.S. is borrowing money $7 billion a day. Think about that. We're borrowing money at over $300 million per hour. $3 million per minute is being borrowed. We're borrowing money at $85,000 a second. This is just spinning literally out of control. If you look at the debt clock online, you can see the numbers, just spinning like crazy. If we're to judge the backroom negotiations between the uni-party leadership in Congress and the White House by its results, we can only conclude that they do not take our spending problem seriously. Even Republicans who talk such a good game about government spending and respect for taxpayer dollars when they're at home cannot be depended upon to fight for fiscal sanity when push comes to shove. Our nation's greatest threat comes not from abroad, but from within the halls of Congress, which at every opportunity look for ways to ignore our spending problem and expedite our economic decline. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office predicts that we will add an average of $2 trillion to our debt every year for the next decade. But there's a breaking point. There's a point at which they print so much money that you can have a catastrophic loss of the value. This is what's happened in South America for decades. It's what's happened in Central America, and we don't want it, at least I don't want it happening in our country. The CBO also estimates that net interest payments will outgrow defense spending this year and will become the largest item, over $800 billion just in interest. This reckless level of borrowing and spending is unsustainable. The ever-increasing heights of our debt mean a weak economy, high inflation, and confiscatory tax rates. In other words, today's spending threatens tomorrow's prosperity. We're approaching a predictable economic crisis in the U.S. In my time in the Senate, I have proposed spending freezes, balanced budgets, spending cuts designed to get our nation back on path. Today, though, instead of a balanced budget, I merely ask this, that this bill be sent back to the Appropriations Committee and that they report to the full Senate about how to responsibly cut 5% from this bloated monstrosity. We wouldn't eliminate anything, but everything you're going to spend money on, grandma, motherhood, apple pie, is going to get 5% less. That's what it would take to start balancing our budget. Wouldn't do it just on this bill because we'd actually have to do that to everything and all the spending, but doing it here today would show that somebody's serious about the spending. My instructions even leave the Appropriations Committee open to determine where to reduce the spending. This isn't asking that much. It's a lopsided compromise in which the select handful of members who wrote this bill get 95% of everything they want. That's what it would mean if we were to pass this cut. Realize when we vote on this cut, though, that not one Democrat will vote to cut 1 penny. Seriously, if we offered an amendment to cut 1 penny, every Democrat would vote no on it. They're resisting voting at all now because they're worried that people at home will discover what they're voting for. But it's more than just the Democrats. No Democrat cares about the deficit. Many Republicans profess to care, but half of them will vote with the Democrats as well. So this is really a bipartisan problem. So don't let anybody tell you this is just all about Joe Biden. It's about the previous administration as well. They borrowed $7 trillion. They shut the economy down. The COVID lockdowns led to extravagant borrowing, more than we've ever seen, and we're continuing it now. But this is a bipartisan problem. It means that rather than spending $1.2 trillion in this package, my proposal would spend $1.14 trillion. Now, some would look at that and say, well, gosh, that's not even very dramatic at all. How did you become so moderate? And, you know, that is true. I am quite the moderate. But it would cut $60 billion. $60 billion. But they will unanimously on the Democrat side vote against this because they're against cutting 1 penny. And our side, half of our people on our side will vote against any cuts also. This is a modest cut and only the beginning of what you would have to do to bring fiscal sanity. I'm willing to accept a reasonable compromise, even one that does not balance the budget significantly or even cut the necessary spending. I'm willing to vote for something to cut some spending. By agreeing to this motion, which will be an amendment later today, we can show that to our constituents that we respect them as taxpayers and are open to the most reasonable attempts to shave down the unsustainable level of spending. Mr. President, I ask that all consider a yes vote on my amendment when the time comes. Madam President.